Okay, so we've added our extract user from JWT function to our Express application, and it exists now in our Express middleware pipeline. But what exactly does that mean? Well, middleware is just a JavaScript function that runs in the middle of the request. So Express accepts an HTTP request, and before it gets past the route handler, or the function we define on the endpoint, Express runs any standard middleware on the request and the response object, including all of these that we declare here, and then it passes it to the route handler or any endpoint-specific middleware we declare there. Now, each middleware can call the next function to pass it to the next middleware. That's why it's called the next function. Or it can send a response back to the client and end the middleware chain. So essentially, the general flow is this. So here's our application. It started up, right? This server accepts an HTTP request to whatever URL with headers and a body. That middleware, that request, it creates the request and the response object. It then passes it through all of these middleware. First to the cores to handle cross-origin resource sharing, set pre-flight headers and all that stuff that has to do with cores that we won't get into here. And then to the express.json middleware, which parses the request body as JSON. Then it logs the request, and now then it gets passed to this security.extract user from JWT middleware that we declared here, and it checks to see if an auth token exists on the request headers. Then it gets passed to, or at least it looks for all the routes and it sees if it matches any of the endpoints, the URL that's passed here. Now, any middleware function that's defined for the whole Express app, again, can call next and pass it to the next function. But when it gets to this section here, any of the routes we declare, it has to actually match the route for that request and response object to then be passed to the route handler. Now, if it does match that route, then the request and response object are passed to something like this. And we see here, request, response, and it still has this next function. So every middleware function kind of has this signature here, which has the request object, the response object, which they can transform, and then the next function. Now, the route handler can either send a response to the client or throw an error or whatever, which exactly what we do in pretty much all of these routes. We do whatever processing here. Maybe we store some stuff in the database. We check to see, in this case, we register a user. And if everything goes well, we can say res.status.json, which means, hey, we're sending a response back to the client. If anything is wrong, again, we call the next function, either with an error or just nothing and just pass it on. Now, once all of that has been handled, the server here, if no response has been sent back by the time it reaches through all of these endpoints that we've declared, it gets passed to either this one here, if it didn't match a route, or this one here, if it threw an error and pass it in as the next function. So then the next function takes that error, and it is the first argument to this handler, to the generic error handler, which finally sends back a response. So that whole pipeline process is how Express handles the requests, HTTP requests, and manages the responses. Now, we've seen all the generic middleware that our app uses, but what about endpoint-specific middleware? We can actually take a look at how they work by using that require authenticated user middleware that we defined a minute ago. First, we'll need to make sure that users who authenticate successfully are sent a JWT token. So let's actually go into that routes auth file that was just in a second ago, and let's import some stuff here. Let's first import that create user, well, I'm just going to make this easier on myself. And we're importing the utils tokens file, and then create user, what do we call that again? Create user JWT? I can't remember. It's not helping me out here. Yeah, create user JWT. Okay, cool. I was right. Create user JWT function. And let's also import the security middleware. Cool. Now, both of these are used, these are used for different things. This is for middleware, and this is a utility function to generate JSON Web Tokens. So the way we generate JSON Web Tokens is we pass this a user, and it will create a token for us. So what's fortunate about that is that we have users in both of these functions, which we can just create a token for. We can say const token equals create user JWT from the user. Now, doing so will create the JSON web token by encoding that user as payload, and then we can just pass that back along with the user, so that whenever a client authenticates successfully, they'll have a token available to them. And we can just do the same thing here, meaning that we are now sending tokens back to the client that uniquely identify a user. That's really nice. The other thing we want to do is let's define a new endpoint here. We'll say router.get me, and we'll give it an async route handler, rec res next, and we'll do a try catch block here. And we will call next with the error if an error exists. Otherwise, let's extract the email from res.locals.user. But hey, if we're doing this, we need to have an authenticated user at this endpoint. Now, if you need to have an authenticated user at endpoint, if we need to ensure that an authenticated user exists, it's probably a good time to actually use some of the security middleware. And in this case, we want to require an authenticated user for this endpoint. Now, the way we're going to do that is by setting a endpoint-specific middleware. So right in between this async route handler and the endpoint definition, we're going to put another function. We're going to say security dot require authenticated user, comma. Now, all this is doing is it's adding another function to the chain of middleware that happens before our route handler is called. So before the request and the response get sent to this route handler, they are first run through the middleware function that ensures an authenticated user exists. If the user included the token in the authorization header, then our extract user from JWT middleware, which we put here, will attach that user to res.locals. If the user doesn't exist, this security.require authenticated user middleware is going to throw an unauthorized error. Let's see that in action to make sure that it is doing what we expect it to. Oh, well, actually, before we do that, let's finish this out. We also want to make sure that once we get their email, that we can fetch the user from the database. And then let's convert it to a public user because we do not want to send back their password. And then let's return that user. So all this endpoint is doing is saying, hey, I want to take the token that was sent in this request, and I want to turn it into a user in our database who can then be sent back to the client with all their information. So if I save this and I head over to Insomnia, and let's do a couple. Actually, let's create an entirely new user here. Let's do this. Let's register a new user. Let's call them person.person.person, and their password is person. And let's register them. Oh, I need to start the server. Good call. Thank you. npm start. Server's running. Okay, cool. I have an error in tokens, utils tokens. Modules.export. Oops, should be module.exports. Okay, let's see if that fixed things. Looks like it did. Great. Let's try it again. Missing username and request body. Oh, did I mess this up? Let's check this out. Oh, you know what? This is from our previous auth, I think our auth model. Excuse me. Yes. I declared that the username was a required field here. Let's get rid of that because we no longer need username. And let's just make sure we're not using it here. Oh, we are. Okay, cool. Let's get rid of that too. We no longer want to manage usernames. Cool. Looks good. Are any of these other ones? We don't need the static fetch user by username anymore. We can get rid of that. Good to know. We do not need this either. So we can get rid of all that username stuff. Great. Let's say invalid email password. Okay. Let's also get rid of this here. Looks like I got rid of all username specific stuff. We no longer need it. Cool. Seems to be working as expected. Let's try it out. Okay, no errors. Let's see if we can sign up. Uh-oh. Let's see what I did wrong here. 124. That's not right. 123. And let's also get rid of credentials.username. Okay, so little speed bump. Let's try it out again. Ah, fantastic. Okay, cool. Some very cool things here. First and foremost, we created our user. We signed them up with their email and password. Their email is here. Is admin, ID, created at. But most importantly, they're passed the JWT token that represents their encoded information. Now, this is exactly what we want. What we're going to do is we're going to take this token here, and we're going to store it in our header under the authorization header. And we're going to pass it in as bearer, and then the actual token itself. Then, we're going to send a request to get auth/me. Let's send that right there, and let's see what happens. Cool. Okay, check it out. We got back the user from a GET request to auth.me. Now, what happens if we don't include this authorization header here? Let's see. Great. We get an unauthorized error. Now, why is that? Again, the reason why is that every request is being checked by our security.requireAuthenticated user. Every request to the auth/me endpoint is being checked by the security require authenticated user middleware that ensures that an authorization header is set on the request that has the token in it. So if we include this token, it works. If we don't have bearer here, unauthorized. If this token is slightly wrong, unauthorized. Any mess up here will cause that token to be incorrect. But if we send the correct token with the proper scheme and header and everything, we will get back the authenticated user. And this is how we will identify every single user who makes requests to our application. Do they include their unique JWT token in the authorization header representing exactly who they are? If they do, we know it's them, and we can let them handle whatever we need to in our application. So it looks like it's working. We had to do a little bit of finagling and some cleanup in our model for user, but otherwise things went pretty seamlessly. I think it's time to commit everything to Git. Let's go ahead and do Git Status, Git add, Git commit, implemented a user or a protected user auth route, and sending back tokens in login and registration routes. All right, now it's time to complete our routes and models and wrap it up.